In the 1970s, a quiet panic swept through the global plastics industry. Not because consumers stopped buying plastic, not because regulations tightened, not because the world woke up to the environmental cost. It was something far simpler and far more dangerous. People started asking a question the industry couldn't afford to answer. What happens to all this plastic when we're done with it? The truth was devastating. Almost none of it could be recycled. Not economically, not chemically, not at scale. It didn't matter how clean the bottles were or how carefully people sorted their waste. The overwhelming majority of plastic was destined for landfills, incinerators, or oceans. But the companies behind plastic couldn't admit that, because admitting it meant facing bans, regulations, consumer backlash, a threat to the entire business model of disposable packaging. So they made a decision that would echo for decades. They didn't change the product, they changed the story. They funded one of the most effective marketing campaigns in corporate history, a story so powerful that it reshaped public perception, delayed environmental action for half a century, and convinced billions of people that recycling plastic was not only possible, but real. It wasn't real. And the people who created the lie knew it from the start. This is the story of a global deception, a decades-long illusion engineered by some of the largest companies on the planet. A story about money, public trust, and the quiet collapse of one of the most successful myths ever sold to the world. It begins with a simple, brutal fact. Plastic was never designed to be recycled. The molecules break down, the polymers degrade, and the economics collapse long before the idea reaches industrial scale. Plastic was engineered to be cheap, durable, disposable, and profitable, not circular. But as environmental activists grew more vocal in the 1970s and 1980s, public pressure mounted. Landfills overflowed, beaches filled with trash. Governments asked questions, journalists investigated, consumers demanded accountability, and the oil and chemical companies, the creators of plastic, realized they were facing a crisis of survival. So they developed a strategy built on misdirection. They hired PR firms, they funded advertising, they launched nonprofit groups with names like Keep America Beautiful. They created public service announcements that blamed littering on individuals instead of corporations. And most importantly, they funded the creation of the recycling symbol, the 3 arrows in a triangle, one of the most recognizable icons on Earth. It suggested something that wasn't true, that plastic moved through a circular loop, that it had a second life, that it went somewhere after you threw it away. The symbol didn't represent reality, it represented hope, and hope was enough. The companies didn't need to solve the plastic problem, they just needed people to believe that someone was solving it. Behind closed doors, internal memos told the real story. Executives admitted recycling was technologically impractical. They warned colleagues that the process was too expensive, that contamination made it unprofitable, that the market for recycled plastic barely existed, that even if the technology improved, recycled plastic would never compete with virgin plastic, which was cheaper, cleaner, and more versatile. One oil executive wrote bluntly, "There is no recovery from plastic waste. Recycling is an illusion." Another said, "Recycling cannot be considered a permanent solution." But the illusion worked. The public embraced recycling. Local governments invested in bins and sorting centers. Schools taught children the importance of reducing waste. Entire industries formed around the idea that plastic had value after use. Few people realized the truth. The system was designed to handle aluminum, paper, and glass, materials that actually could be recycled economically. Plastic was a Trojan horse inside the system, a material that looked recyclable but wasn't. And the companies behind it were thrilled. For decades, the recycling narrative kept plastic production soaring. Every time the world worried about pollution, the companies reminded them to recycle. When people questioned plastic bags, they pointed to recycling drop-offs. When countries complained about plastic waste, the industry responded with glossy brochures and sustainability campaigns. The lie expanded every time public pressure rose, and every expansion bought the industry more time. By the 1990s, the truth became harder to hide. Mountains of plastic accumulated, recycling centers struggled, sorting facilities closed, plastic piled up in warehouses. But the companies found a solution, not a real solution, but one that kept the illusion alive. They exported the problem. For decades, the United States and Europe shipped millions of tons of plastic waste to Asia. Countries like China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines became dumping grounds for foreign trash labeled as recycling. Much of it was burned. Much of it was dumped. Much of it ended up in rivers that carried it to the ocean. Consumers thought they were recycling, but their waste was being moved, not renewed. By 2018, China finally pushed back. They banned most foreign plastic imports. The global recycling illusion collapsed almost overnight. Countries scrambled, plastic piled up, and the world faced a brutal realization: plastic recycling had never been real. And now the system built on that lie was falling apart. But the companies responsible weren't done yet. As pressure mounted in the 2010s, they launched new campaigns. They funded new ads. They claimed new breakthroughs. They promised new innovations. They pushed the idea of chemical recycling, a vague term that suggested alchemy, transformation, renewal. But chemical recycling was not a breakthrough. It was a distraction. A handful of pilot plants opened and quietly shut down. The process required enormous energy. It created toxic byproducts. It produced oils too contaminated to reuse economically. Most chemical recycling plants ended up converting plastic into low-grade fuel and burning it. It wasn't recycling. It was incineration with extra steps. And yet companies continued promoting it because promoting the idea bought them time. Time to keep producing plastic. Time to avoid regulation. Time to maintain profits. The illusion didn't need to be real. It just needed to survive long enough. Meanwhile, plastic production skyrocketed. If you charted the line from 1950 to today, it looks like a rocket. Exponential, unbroken, relentless. The world now produces over 400 million tons of plastic every year. More than 90% of it is never recycled. Almost all of it ends up in landfills, oceans, or incinerators. Every minute, the equivalent of a garbage truck full of plastic enters the ocean. Every minute, every day, every year. And still, the illusion persists. People separate their waste, sort their plastics, wash their containers, check the numbers on the bottom of bottles, feel good about doing the right thing. But the numbers, those resin codes, were not created to inform consumers. They were created to confuse them, to make them believe every symbol represented something recyclable. In reality, only two types of plastic can be recycled economically at scale: PET and HDPE, typically water bottles and milk jugs. Everything else, the majority, goes to landfills. The industry knew this when they created the codes. They knew consumers wouldn't understand the difference. And they knew confusion worked in their favor. Plastic recycling wasn't designed to solve pollution. Plastic recycling was designed to solve a PR problem. And it succeeded so completely that entire generations believed it was real. The tragedy of this story isn't just environmental. It's psychological. It's cultural. It's moral. An entire world believed a lie because they wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too bleak, because people wanted to feel responsible, empowered, environmentally conscious, because recycling felt like control in a world overwhelmed by waste. And the companies understood that feeling. They built an entire strategy around it. The brilliance of the plastic recycling lie is not that it fooled people, it's that it made people feel good about being fooled. It turned pollution into participation, waste into ritual, a crisis into a task on a checklist. And as long as the bins were full, the companies could ignore the oceans. But deception always has a cost, and eventually the cost becomes undeniable. Today, microplastics are everywhere, in rivers, in fish, in agricultural soil, in the air we breathe, in the water we drink, in human bloodstreams, in placentas, in newborn infants, in the deepest trenches of the ocean and the highest peaks of the Himalayas. Plastic doesn't disappear. It breaks down into smaller pieces, pieces that enter ecosystems and never leave. And the companies responsible for this never-ending residue continue producing more plastic every year than the year before, because they know something undeniable. Plastic is profitable. Not because it's recycled, but because it isn't. If plastic had to be truly recyclable, the entire economic model behind it would collapse. Virgin plastic is cheap, recycled plastic is expensive, virgin plastic is strong, recycled plastic is weak, virgin plastic is abundant, recycled plastic is scarce. Recycling was never meant to replace virgin plastic, it was meant to protect it. And the illusion worked for 50 years. The story of plastic recycling is not a story about failure, it's a story about success, corporate success. A success built on deception, psychology, narrative control, and public trust. The public never needed proof, they needed reassurance. And reassurance is easier to sell than truth. But in every system built on denial, there comes a moment of reckoning. Countries are banning single-use plastics, regulators are investigating industry campaigns, Courts are reopening decades-old environmental cases. Consumers are learning that the system they trusted never existed. And scientists warn that the next generation will live in a world permanently shaped by microplastic contamination. The lie kept the industry alive, but the consequences will outlive everyone who told it. The most devastating part of this story is how preventable it was. The world could have invested in alternatives decades ago. Biodegradable materials, refillable systems, reuse networks, real solutions. But why innovate when a lie is cheaper? Plastic didn't become a crisis because people littered. Plastic became a crisis because people were told not to question it. The companies responsible hid the truth behind symbols, behind ads, behind slogans, behind a familiar triangle on the bottom of every bottle. A symbol that promised renewal but delivered waste. A symbol that represented not recycling, but reassurance. The plastic recycling lie is more than a corporate scandal. It is one of the longest-running, most effective public relations campaigns in modern history. A campaign that delayed environmental progress, misled entire generations, and allowed a global crisis to grow unchecked. But illusions don't last forever. Truth has a way of resurfacing, slowly at first, then all at once. And when it comes to plastic, the truth is this: recycling didn't fail. It was never real. Because the companies behind plastic never intended to solve the problem. They intended to survive it. And for 50 years they did, flawlessly, quietly, strategically. But the cost of that survival is now everywhere. In water, soils, blood, oceans, and air. And the world is left with the final devastating irony. Plastic was never designed to be recycled, but the lie was, and it worked perfectly.